So a compression test, we're going to use a compression gauge, and we have this special adapter that we can use 2 different spark plug sizes as we thread this into the different spark plug holes. To do this test effectively, we have to have all 4 of these removed. So all 4 spark plugs have to be removed. You can see our wires are up here. And to disengage the electrical system so that we don't have sparks flying with the wires, we need to go to the fuse relay box, and we need to pull 2 fuses. The 2 fuses we're going to pull are the ECM, which controls spark A and B. So these are 10 amp fuses. I can use a needle nose pliers here to pull the 10 amp, and then I just keep it here so I don't lose it. And I'm going to keep them in there. Okay, and so just put this in a safe place so we don't lose it. This will keep the car from starting and sparks from flying as we crank the engine over. We also need to have a battery charger charging the battery so that the crank of the engine is consistent. If the crank of the engine is not consistent, then we're going to have different readings. Okay? And so what we'll do is we'll start with cylinder number 1, and we're going to do a first crank, which will bounce up and show us hopefully half of the total PSI. And then we'll do the 5th crank test, and that should be double the PSI of the half. Okay? And we've got an assistant in the car that's going to crank the engine for us. But to help us put this in a little bit better, we're gonna just disconnect this like our air hoses. And we're going to thread this into the spark plug hole until it stops. You don't need to keep cranking it down, but just so it's snug. And then we just pull back on this, and we're going to give our assistant the okay to crank the engine. So what I want is a 1 crank. So go ahead and get it ready for 1 crank. And I'll stop. Yep, good. Okay, let's try that one more time. So just do the 1 crank. Stop. And you can see that the PSI went to 90. Okay? So we put that on our paper as the first puff 90. To release the pressure, we're gonna push this, and now we're back to the 5th crank. So now he's gonna crank it over for about 3 seconds. Go ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4. And our total PSI is 155. So is that half? Is 90? That's maybe a little bit more than half. Let's try it one more time, and we'll tell you where to stop. Go ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more. 5, 6. Okay, we're at stopped, and we are 160 PSI. So 90 is slightly over half the 190, or sorry, the 160, okay? So I write that on my paper. I release the pressure, and I need to now move to the next cylinder. So I'm gonna do this cylinder's test. Okay, so I'm gonna have you crank it over 1. Okay, and that shows it's at about 75. Okay, go ahead and crank it over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? And we're about 130. So we record that down and relieve the pressure. And then we move to the next cylinder. Okay? So then we move to this one. And we're going to crank it over once. One, and that one shows 75. Release the pressure and go again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're about 130. Okay, so I relieve the pressure, and then I test the last cylinder. Okay, so go ahead and crank it once. One, oops, let's try that one more time. Just one. Okay, and that one is almost 80. And go ahead and crank it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're sitting at about 130. So most of the cylinders is half, and we're sitting about 130. Okay, so the one over here was slightly higher, right? Let's test that just one more time, just to make sure. So I'm gonna thread this one in. Just click it. That's 90 again. Okay, and then do it one more time. Yep, okay, so let's crank it 5 seconds. Okay, and this is up to about 155. So this cylinder is contributing more than the other three. Okay, so when we have something like this, we want to compare it to specifications. What's going on? Is this cylinder got too much carbon deposits on it? Are these cylinders not contributing to what it should be? So with that being said, we need to consult service information to see what's going on. The wet test, we're going to use some oil, and we're just going to squirt a little bit of oil down in the cylinder. Okay, so after I squirt a little bit of oil in the cylinder, then I'm going to repeat that test. So the reason why I do the wet test is seeing if the rings are sealing. So if the rings are sealing, the PSI should be half like we showed you before. If it stays below, then there's usually a valve that's the problem. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit it once. Okay, so we're about 75 still. Okay, so with it being 75, and then crank it over to the fifth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 130. We know that's half the compression. So if it jumped to 90, for example, and then went to 150 like this number one, we know the cylinder rings would be the problem. Okay, so they call that a wet test because the oil goes in there and seals the rings. And then if the PSI increases, then we know that the cylinder is sealed properly. And again, don't forget to remove the pressure by pushing this little valve on the side before you go to any of the other cylinders. Okay, so after you've completed those tests, you're going to put all the spark plugs back in. And we're going to put them into what they say they are, according to the number that we had numbered. Okay, and we're gonna make sure that it starts when we're done, because that's part of the lab. We don't wanna leave stuff half done. So I'm gonna thread this in. Okay, all the way in here. The threads are long. You can remember those plugs. I'm gonna thread them all in by hand so we don't cross thread them. Okay. To make sure they're all tightened down properly. That one's a little bit too much. Okay, when it goes red like that, I'm going to, a little bit too tight. Just go till it's green. That way we don't have a spark plug come out on us. So just to double check slowly, that's 20, 20, 20, just like our lug nuts. Okay, everything's torqued. Okay, and again, when we're not using this, gently set it back in. Okay, now that we've torqued our spark plugs down, we're going to hook the wires back in. And we're going to put those back in and push it down till it clicks. And you can see these are all according to length, which makes it nice. Some spark plug wires aren't this long, and we're not this lucky to tighten these back in. Okay. Reference on the valve or on the cover to plug them back in. So be careful not to drop these. If you drop them, then we're gonna have to go get one for you. Okay, and then this just goes back on. And then leave the clutch in and go ahead and start it. And that's what we want to hear when we're done with our lap, where the engine now is running.